I don't want to use the word mistake, John, because if I do, it gets taken out of the context that you're asking me the question on.
Well, did we pay too high a price?
Yeah, I would say that what we should realize and have realized that there will be deleterious collateral consequences when you do something like that. This idea that this virus doesn't afflict children is not so. It does. We've lost close to 1,500 kids so far.
But much less than the older population, obviously.
Oh, of course. Yeah. But you shouldn't discount that it does afflict children, so it isn't without consequences. If you go back, and I ask anybody to go back over the number of times that I've said we've got to do everything we can to keep the schools open, no one plays that clip. They always come back and say Fauci was responsible for closing schools. I had nothing to do.
That was outgoing White House Chief Medical Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci on ABC News this week, pushing back on any notion that he had anything to do whatsoever with the collateral damage that shutting down schools had on kids during COVID.
Fauci, who says he will step down after serving in his role as head of NIH's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, reflected on his tenure, adamantly defending his response to COVID-19, but acknowledging now that mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made by someone else in a passive kind of sense. He doesn't like to call it a mistake because, you know, then I guess he's subjected to some amount of scrutiny. There's probably no federal official or bureaucrat ever wants to admit anything's a mistake, but it was a catastrophic mistake. We see, you can see the math and reading test scores plummeting, the social anxiety, the difficulty for parents who then had to watch their kids, remote learning, just an absolute farce for so many kids. Some kids did fine with. I think the kids who are already quite academically gifted, who can learn on their own, who are already very ahead, we're doing fine maybe. But the kids who most need both the structure of school and the advantage that a dedicated teacher can provide them, they were just so negatively impacted by this.
Absolutely. And I won't say that it was a mistake, so to speak, as it was unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. And as somebody who's worked in education policy for a long time, full disclosure, I currently work for the former Secretary of Education under Obama, John King. Learning loss is real, and learning loss technically happens almost every year. We count that among summer vacation as well, and we call that the brain drain. But here, where you had students who were out in some cases almost 2 years, be it whether they were doing remote learning or whether they were doing some hybrid model, depending on the school district, what we know is that specifically school districts that are in impoverished areas, those that have larger concentrations of communities of color, places where there was already some issues related to reading and math on grade level, those are the areas that got hit the hardest, in addition to watching teachers leave. The teacher shortage was largely funneled. We were going to have it anyway. Numbers showed that a decade ago that fewer people were going to college to get education degrees and teach in the classroom. But now we see so many teachers that have left since the pandemic, never to return. So there are teacher shortages. There is the social impact for the young people. They're not socialized with other young people of their grade,
and that's
because
gonna be huge.
Obviously, they're at home.
And we're seeing antisocial behavior because of that. We're seeing
anxiety and depression levels increased among these young people. The digital divide. Several school districts didn't even have the capacity for students to sign up to do anything online. We know that in some of our larger school districts in New York, in LA, in Chicago, in Atlanta, you would have 60%, sometimes over that, of students who didn't sign in at all for any class. Mm-hmm. So learning loss was huge. And now we're seeing the fruits of that, so to speak, when it comes to the percentage points decline in particularly math and reading, essential building blocks of success. When you have math and reading scores that are lower now than they were before the pandemic, and sizably so, again, in some of our larger districts, you're talking double percentage decreases. That's a huge shift because it means more people aren't going to graduate from high school. We're seeing dropout rates increase, which America has been steady for at least 12 or 13 years now with increases in high school graduation. That is being reversed. If you don't graduate from high school, many people aren't going to go and get the GED and then go on to college. So we're talking about long-term consequences of not having financial stability, because in this country, much to the chagrin of myself as well, you have to have a degree, because of the way our system is set up, to actually get not only a living wage job, but a job that provides you health insurance, a job that provides you benefits, a job that allows for you in many cases to be able to afford that home, or at least be able to have access to housing. That is not what is going to happen when we see so many students, literally thousands of students. In that clip you showed, Fauci mentioned maybe 1,500 that, might have gotten COVID. We're talking about 40 states that were surveyed that showed hundreds of thousands of students who are basically set back, and set back not only months in some cases, 5 or 6 months in terms of their educational acumen, but years, depending on where they were, the concentration of poverty and things like that.
Right. And it's so dishonest for him to kind of say, well, I am blameless here because I was not in charge of the school policies. Sure, fine, but federal guidance on COVID, we did not do at least if you lived in an area controlled by Democrats, a blue area, which most of our cities are, they did not go their own course. They marched in lockstep to what the CDC was telling them, what the White House coronavirus advisors were saying. And the guidance on that was so clearly toward fear of COVID. And look, which is not to say that's fear, like any fear of COVID was illegitimate. Like we've talked about, the impacts on elderly and immunocompromised people are significant.
Which several of those are also in our schools, be it whether they're teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, things like that.
But you had even after the point at which all the staff members of these places were able to be vaccinated, you still had schools not resuming immediately. I mean, as you probably know, the teachers union leadership advocated for, I heard Randy Weingarten say it on TV, say she really would not be comfortable having schools resume until there was something approaching no COVID transmission in schools whatsoever, which we now know will never happen, or it's just not going to happen in the next decade. That was the level of disinclination for putting students' needs first. That they would, and in fact, schools stayed shut down more than anything else in our entire society.
I was going to say,
restaurants were open. People went back to work. Many people had to work the whole time. Working people still went to work, and we talk about how we were all virtual. A lot of people were not virtual for any
did not have the
time.
opportunity to be virtual.
Restaurants open. Everyone back to work. Everything operating because it had to happen. Schools still shut down. That was true in this city. D.C. was one of the most school shut down, one of the most locked down places in general, but especially the schools, how long it took. And then with, all sorts of mitigation efforts, still masking, et cetera, which I personally believe it has contributed to some degree of learning loss. I think for some kids, it's hard to understand their teachers if they're all having to wear masks all the time. It's clearly impacted their kind of social development, and some schools were still requiring kids to wear masks while they were doing sports and things like that. It's a whole different subject. But
in the early aughts of the pandemic, I agreed with a lot of what we saw school districts do across the country. Quite frankly, because we didn't know, we didn't have all the information that we needed about how this was spread, and we wanted to take care of kids. This isn't the first time that we've seen districts that were afflicted shut down. Like right now, Jackson Public Schools has shut down in Mississippi largely because there is no running water. I think that there are things that exist, particularly as we heard from Dr. Fauci as well as other leading health professionals about mitigation efforts, whether it was air quality in schools, ventilation, whether it was making sure that they had clean water, whether it was reducing class size, whether it was somewhat stalling school schedules to reduce the amount of people in the halls. These types of things were designed to mitigate once students got back. I will concede that I think students should have been in the classroom again sooner. The learning loss does not equate to me with what the public health scare happened to be, especially for the young people, because our youngest learners, quite frankly, weren't necessarily as affected in the same way from that public health crisis as some of the older individuals.
Not nearly.
So,
not even close.
Yeah, it lasted way too long, and I don't think that those young people, sadly, are going to be able to recoup what they've lost.
Very frustrating. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay tuned.